How do you answer when American troops are attacked, lives are lost, and the whole region seems one bad move away from a much larger war? Because for a brief, dangerous moment, that was the question hanging over Washington, Tehran, Jordan, and every U.S. position watching the sky. Before we go any further, do one quick thing for me. Like this video, subscribe for clear breakdowns without the drama, and share this with one person who wants facts before panic. What happened next was fast, deliberate, and loaded with meaning. The United States did not spend days talking, warning, or trying to look tough on camera. It moved. And when it moved, it sent a message aimed at one audience above all others. If you kill American service members, there will be a response, and it will not be random. That is the center of this story. Not just that American troops were attacked, not just that lives were lost, but that the retaliation came quickly, appeared highly targeted, and landed inside a moment when the entire region was already tense, tired, and dangerously close to sliding into something even bigger. According to the reporting that followed the attack, the strike in Jordan killed 2 American service members, left another missing in the immediate aftermath, and triggered a rapid U.S. military response. The response focused on forces linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, and that matters because this was not framed as a vague warning shot. It was framed as punishment. Now, when people hear a title like this, they usually picture one simple story. America gets hit. America hits back harder. End of story. But that is not really what makes this important. What makes it important is everything around the strike. The speed, the choice of target, the message to Iran, the reassurance to allies, the warning to militias, the risk of escalation, and the deeper question sitting underneath all of it. Does fast retaliation restore deterrence, or does it lock both sides into a cycle that gets more dangerous every single round? To understand that, we need to slow down and walk through what this moment actually says. Because in modern conflict, the strike itself is only part of the story. The rest is about signaling, timing, credibility, and whether your enemy believes you will do tomorrow what you did today. Reports describe the initial attack as a combination of drones and missiles aimed at a location in Jordan used by U.S. forces and partners. That kind of attack is serious for a reason. It is not just about damage. It is about pressure. Drones can force defenders to split their attention, while missiles compress reaction time and raise the chance that something gets through. Put those two threats together and you're not just testing defenses. You are trying to overload them. And when service members die in an attack like that, the military question changes instantly. It is no longer only about force protection. It becomes a credibility test. If the United States absorbs the strike and responds weakly, every hostile actor watching the region learns the same lesson. If you push hard enough, maybe Washington hesitates. Maybe the cost is manageable. Maybe you can keep probing. That is exactly why the reported U.S. response matters so much. Because speed in this kind of moment is not only about revenge, it is about clarity. A delayed response can still be powerful, but a fast response does something different. It shrinks uncertainty. It shows the decision was not trapped in paralysis. It tells allies the chain of command is working. And it tells adversaries that targeting data, strike options, and political approval were ready much sooner than they may have hoped. In other words, the retaliation was not just explosive, it was communicative. It said, we know who we believe did this, we can reach them, and we are willing to act quickly after American casualties. That is a very important message in a region where hesitation is often interpreted as weakness and overreaction can create new enemies overnight. And this is where the IRGC piece becomes central, because the IRGC is not just another military formation inside Iran. It is one of the main engines of Iran's regional power. It is tied to missile programs, drone development, external operations, and proxy relationships. It represents the broader strategy Tehran has used for years to challenge stronger opponents without always fighting them in a fully conventional way. So when American officials or military reporting point to the IRGC by name, that is not a small detail. That is the message getting sharper. It means the retaliation is not being sold as a blind strike against Iran in general. It is being framed as a strike against the specific apparatus believed to be responsible. That distinction matters militarily, politically, and psychologically. Militarily, it suggests the United States wanted to damage capability, not just create headlines. Politically, it helps justify the action as targeted rather than reckless. Psychologically, it tells the other side, we are not confused about who we are talking to. And that last part matters more than many people realize. In conflicts like this, precision in language can be almost as important as precision in weapons, because the side delivering the strike is always sending multiple messages at once. One to the domestic audience, one to allies, one to enemy leadership, one to field commanders, and one to every proxy force wondering how much room it still has to operate. The strike, then, was not simply about punishing a past attack, it was also about shaping future behavior. At least that is the goal. Whether it works is a separate question. And this is where the story becomes less comfortable, because every retaliation can do 2 opposite things at the same time. It can restore deterrence by showing strength, and it can intensify escalation by creating a fresh need for the other side to answer back. That is the trap. The United States wants to prove that killing its troops carries real consequences. Iran and IRGC-linked actors want to prove they cannot be pushed around without response. Regional governments want protection without becoming battlegrounds. And civilians living near bases, ports, power systems, and border areas are the ones forced to live inside the consequences. This is why the Jordan attack hit such a nerve. Jordan is not just a random dot on the map. It sits inside a region where geography is destiny. It connects theaters, hosts partnerships, and occupies space between some of the most sensitive political and military fault lines on Earth. Any attack there is not just local, it echoes. Then came the warnings that suggested the danger might not stop with one strike. Reports described concern about further attacks, including threats tied to major transit points and coastal infrastructure. That kind of warning changes the emotional climate immediately. Suddenly, this is not only about soldiers on a remote base. It becomes about airports, ports, cities, shipping lanes, air defenses, radar screens, and families wondering if the next alert will be real. And that is one of the hardest parts of modern regional conflict to explain. The battlefield is not neat. It leaks. A missile aimed at one country can create intercept debris risks in another. A drone launch in one zone can trigger alerts in several capitals. A strike on infrastructure can ripple into water supply, electricity, fuel prices, and commercial shipping. A single attack on troops can turn into a weekend of military warnings for millions of civilians. So when multiple countries raise their defensive posture at the same time, that is not theater. That is exhaustion in motion. It means systems are being activated, crews are being alerted, intelligence is being shared, and leaders are trying to read intent in real time while hoping they are not one misread away from a wider war. Quick pause and a different ask. If this breakdown is giving you the bigger picture instead of just the loudest headline, tap subscribe, hit the bell, and drop this video into your group chat so more people can follow what actually matters. Now think about what that level of readiness says. It says the region is no longer reacting only after impact. It is living in anticipation. And a region that lives in anticipation is a region under strain. That strain matters because high alert is not a permanent condition any country can sustain forever without mistakes, fatigue, or political pressure building underneath it. The other side of this story is the human cost. It is very easy in videos like this to get pulled into hardware, strategy and map lines, and forget what triggered the retaliation in the first place. American service members were killed, families were shattered, others were wounded or left unaccounted for in the immediate chaos. For the military, that changes the emotional temperature instantly. For the public, it should. Because once casualties enter the picture, every following action carries a different moral and political weight. This is also why leaders talk the way they do after attacks like this. They are not only explaining operations, they are speaking to grief, anger, and public expectation. If the response looks timid, they are accused of weakness. If it looks reckless, they are accused of gambling with a larger war. There is almost no comfortable lane, only narrower and wider versions of risk. And there is another point here that matters. Fast retaliation usually means the military had options ready. That tells us something important. It tells us commanders were not improvising from zero after the attack. Target packages, surveillance, and strike planning likely existed in some form already because they had to. In a theater this active, no serious military waits for the crisis to begin before thinking about what it might hit if the crisis gets worse. That does not make the strike automatic. Political approval still matters. Legal review still matters. Confidence in the target still matters. But it does mean the machinery of response was already humming. And that alone says something about how dangerous this phase of the conflict had already become. You do not maintain that kind of readiness in a calm environment. You maintain it when you expect the next blow may come soon. Now let's talk about why a targeted strike against IRGC-linked forces sends a stronger signal than a broad strike against generic sites. A broad strike can look dramatic, but it can also look unfocused. A targeted strike says something colder. It says this is not emotion alone. This is selection. This is identification. This is accountability. That matters because Iran has long relied on layers, distance, deniability, and indirect pressure as part of its regional method. The more clearly the United States can say, this unit, this network, this chain, the harder it becomes for that method to feel cost-free. Again, whether that changes behavior is another matter. But from a signaling perspective, that is the intent. And yet, even as Washington tries to reestablish deterrence, it has to think about the next move. Because deterrence is never a speech. It is a relationship between action and expectation. Your enemy is always judging three things: what you did, what you avoided, and what you are likely to do next. If Tehran or its aligned forces conclude the U.S. response was painful but limited, they may still believe they can continue testing the line below a certain threshold. If they conclude the United States is prepared to keep escalating every time Americans are killed, they may become more cautious, or they may feel forced to answer in some other domain where they think they hold an advantage. That could mean cyber pressure, maritime disruption, proxy fire, or attacks calibrated to stay just ambiguous enough to avoid a direct jump into full-scale war. That is what makes this kind of situation so difficult. Both sides may believe they are acting rationally. Both sides may believe they are restoring stability, and both sides may be laying the path to the next round. There is also a historical pattern behind all of this. When American service members are killed in attacks tied to Iran-backed or IRGC-linked networks, the U.S. has often answered with targeted military action. Action aimed at command nodes, weapon storage, launch sites, or operational infrastructure creates a pattern. That pattern matters because patterns create expectations, and expectations shape behavior. If your adversary knows that certain actions will trigger a fast answer that can restrain them, but only if they believe the answer will be consistent. Consistency is the core of deterrence. Not rage, not speeches, not even military power by itself. Consistency. The belief that the red line exists, that the other side means it, and that the consequences will follow. And that is why this response was watched so closely. Not only for what was destroyed, but for what it signaled about future U.S. behavior. Because the entire region is measuring that. Allies are measuring it. Militias are measuring it. Iran is measuring it. And perhaps most importantly, the families of deployed service members are measuring it too. They want to know whether attacks on Americans bring real consequences, or whether their loved ones are serving inside a cycle where accountability stays blurry. There's another layer that deserves attention, the information war. In modern conflict, the strike is followed almost instantly by competing stories. Who was hit? How badly? Why it happened? Military action now comes packaged with narrative combat. And that narrative matters because public perception shapes political room to maneuver. If Iran-linked messaging frames an attack as proof of strength, it feeds domestic pride and regional intimidation. If the United States frames retaliation as precise justice, it strengthens deterrence and reassures allies. If either side loses control of the story, it can lose strategic ground even after a tactical success. That is why public claims, official statements, embassy warnings, and defense alerts all matter. They are not just updates, they are pieces of a larger contest over meaning. And maybe the most sobering part of this whole story is that both the kinetic war and the information war can intensify at the same time. A missile exchange raises fear, a propaganda exchange hardens positions. Together, they make diplomatic off-ramps harder to sell. This is the part many audiences do not see. Breaking the cycle is not just about stopping fire. It is about creating a moment where both sides can step back without feeling humiliated. That is extraordinarily difficult after troop deaths, retaliatory strikes, and public threats. Because once blood has been spilled and strength has been publicly performed, compromise begins to look like surrender to somebody. That does not mean diplomacy is impossible. It means the price of reaching it rises every time the cycle repeats. Here's my second checkpoint for you, and I'm asking it differently. If you want more videos that cut through the noise and give the full picture, join this channel. Now ask yourself the larger question. What was the United States trying to achieve here beyond immediate retaliation? At minimum, 4 things. First, punish the force believed responsible. Second, reestablish deterrence after American deaths. Third, reassure partners in the region that Washington will respond when its troops are attacked. And fourth, do all of that without triggering a direct state-on-state war. That fourth goal is the hardest, because you are trying to be strong enough to impose cost, but controlled enough to avoid a larger explosion. That is a razor-thin line, and history is full of moments where leaders thought they had walked that line successfully, only to discover the other side saw it differently. This is why so much attention falls on target choice. What you hit tells the other side how you define the event. If you hit symbolic sites, you may be signaling anger. If you hit operational nodes, you are signaling disruption. If you hit leadership, you are signaling escalation. If you hit wide civilian infrastructure, you are signaling that restraint is fading. That distinction is important in public discussion. Once conflict begins to spread into power systems, water facilities, and civilian industry, the stakes widen fast because you are affecting daily life and economic stability. Regional governments do not want to be passive spectators while missiles fly overhead or become the main stage for someone else's war. That creates intense pressure on them to improve defenses, coordinate intelligence, manage public fear, and avoid being dragged further in. So when you see multiple governments raising air defense readiness at once, that is a political story about the perceived immediacy of danger. And then there is the strategic fatigue factor. A prolonged crisis drains everyone. Operators, analysts, and decision makers get tired. And the longer this environment continues, the greater the chance that one miscalculation or one bad assumption turns a contained confrontation into something uncontrollable. That is why people who study war often worry less about the single dramatic strike and more about the sustained tempo around it. One event can be managed. Weeks or months of retaliation cycles normalize danger, leading to risks that would have been rejected in calmer moments. There is also a moral question beneath the military one. What does justice look like after an attack on service members? The public often wants certainty in moments like this. Clear heroes, clear villains, clear outcomes. But real conflict almost never offers that clean shape. So was this response effective? Tactically, if it struck the intended targets and imposed real cost, then yes, it achieved an immediate objective. Strategically, the answer takes longer, because strategy is judged not by the blast, but by what happens after the smoke clears. Do attacks on U.S. personnel decrease? Do proxy forces pull back? Does Iran recalculate? Or does the cycle return, angrier and more inventive than before? That is the sobering truth. Power can answer an attack. It cannot by itself solve the political logic that keeps producing them. That is the dangerous middle ground we are watching now. Not peace, not total war, but a violent gray zone where everyone believes they can control the temperature until they cannot. The central question is whether hitting back hard creates enough cost to prevent the next attack without setting the conditions for the next escalation. Strength has to be credible, but credibility without control can become a trap. Control without credibility can become an invitation. In plain English, this was not just a strike. It was a warning that the gap between limited retaliation and wider regional war can get frighteningly small. If you made it all the way here, hit like and share this video so more people understand not just what happened, but why it matters. The strongest takeaway is that the entire region is now operating under the shadow of what the next answer might be. That is what makes this story bigger than one night or one airstrike. It is about the rules of engagement being written in real time. A dangerous chain of action and reaction where every show of strength solves one problem while risking a larger one tomorrow.